from thegeezerdeathstar.com. It was published on October the 30th, 2016 by Joseph P. Fowle. Abe welcomes Duterte. Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte has been making headlines and waves lately for his increasingly caustic stance against the USA and his overtures to China amid the hotly contested issues in the South China Sea. So much so that there has even been speculation on the internet concerning just how long Mr. Duterte will be allowed to continue the attacks against Washington before he is heart attacked and the Philippines is, quote, spontaneously regime changed by the indigenous freedom fighters which Washington supports, end quote. In other words, guys, ISIS. Of course, the problem is Mr. Duterte thinks of his country as a sovereign nation, which it is, and Washington, in its global fantasies, thinks all nations are obsolete, which they are not. All borders are lines on a map, which they aren't, and all places with bases are USSA spaces, which they are not. The problem for Washington now, of course, is that the American lamestream media's credibility is so low, and Washington has played the regime change card so much that no one will believe it, even in Manila, where it still has many friends. The other problem is that Mr. Duterte, behind his over-the-top rhetoric, appears to be playing a more cagey game, as this article shared by Mr. TM suggests. Published on the 26th of October at AFP, Business Insider, Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte has taken his US bashing to Japan. Tokyo AFP, Philippine President Rodrigo Duterte was set on Wednesday to persuade Japanese executives his country is, quote, open for business, end quote, after upending traditional alliances by insulting the US and making overtures to China. The acid-tongued leader arrived in Tokyo on Tuesday on his first visit to Japan since taking office on June 30th and admittedly continued a tirade against longtime ally the US began earlier in the year. Duterte vehemently criticized Washington for questioning his crime crackdown, which has claimed some 3,700 lives and attracted widespread international criticism, as I've covered a lot of times on this channel already, guys. He has insulted President Barack Obama. On Tuesday in Japan, before a cheering audience of resident Filipinos, Duterte called Americans, quote, stupid, end quote, but went out of his way to praise his hosts. Quote, Japan has really been our biggest helper, end quote, he said, pointing to help with an airport and road building projects. Quote, the fact is, they are really so very kind, end quote. Duterte told reporters before he left that he was keen to boost bilateral trade and was looking forward to meeting top Japanese executives. Quote, I will tell them clearly that the Philippines is open for business, end quote, he said, adding he wanted Japanese cooperation on key infrastructure projects. Quote, in particular, he can tap the experience and expertise of Japan in developing high-quality modern public transportation, end quote, he said. He is set to speak to Japanese business executives on Wednesday before holding a summit with Prime Minister Shinzo Abe later in the day. Duterte will also meet with Emperor Akihito during the trip, which follows his headline-grabbing state visit to China last week. Bilateral relations. Duterte's harsh criticism of Washington is likely to be embarrassing for Tokyo, which depends on the US for its security, but Japan itself has so far avoided any criticism, while the US has taken a calm approach. Quote, we're going to take the long view, end quote, State Department spokesman John Kirby said regarding Tuesday's verbal assault. Quote, we're not going to react and respond to every bit of rhetoric. We're going to continue to work at this relationship, end quote, he added. Abe had worked to improve bilateral relations with Duterte's predecessor, Benigno Aquino, and has continued that approach with Duterte. Japan provided patrol boats to support the Philippines in its territorial row with Beijing over rival claims to the South China Sea, as it sought backing in its own maritime dispute with China, Aquino took Beijing to the International Tribunal over its extensive claims in the South China Sea, where it has built artificial islands capable of hosting military facilities, and the Philippines won resounding victory in July, and I've obviously covered that story quite in depth as well. So back to the main article. If one didn't know better, one might speculate and conclude that Mr. Duterte is not only seeking to open up better relations with China and to seek China investment in his country, but that by following his summit with Mr. Xi Jinping to do the same with Japan in order to continue its aid in the Philippines. And again, the key word in all of these discussions is, quote, infrastructure, end quote. The USSA builds bases and can offer little else. China and Japan build airports, high-speed rail, and so on. If the pattern continues, one should expect Mr. Duterte to make significant overtures to the other country's economic powerhouse in the region, Indonesia. In effect, Mr. Duterte appears to be trying to carefully position the Philippines between the two Asian economic powers, a dangerous game, but one that must be played if the Philippines is to become more independent of the USSA. But there's something else being suggested in this article, something else lying between. So what's really going on here, guys, as we're covering on this channel, is Duterte is ripping the ties that he has with the States. And in exchange, he is then moving into China and Japan to get not only military support, quite likely, but the main key aspect of cooperation in infrastructure. Because Asia is all about growth and business. They're not interested in war. The reason they are having huge militaries and offshore bases is a protection mechanism for Western invasion, I believe, in my opinion, obviously. But China has no threat from the Philippines. It has no threat from Japan. It has no threat from Russia. It is setting up established business infrastructure networks across the whole eastern continents. This is obviously hugely damaging to the power position of Western governments, because they can't combat it, they can't fight it. All they can do is implement sanctions and try to induce war in order to potentially overthrow other governments to capture more ground. And this is all just a giant chessboard, a game being played by the people in power, while normal people go about their daily lives, not only oblivious, but not wanting to have global wars, to have global currency resets. People just want to get on with their lives and have their normal lives to enjoy. But this ending next few years is going to be hugely disruptive to everybody, but is a necessary thing to occur simply because of what's been manipulated within the system. And nothing has been done. It goes on to say, but there's something else being suggested in this article, something else lying between the lines, something else laying between the lines once again. And this occurs towards the end of the article, after it notes that Mr. Duterte will also meet with Japanese Emperor Akihito. Quote, Yoshihide Suga, Japan's top government spokesman, said on Wednesday that the government will continue to aid Philippine development, but he sidestepped whether relations with the US will be a summit topic. He said Abe will seek, quote, frank exchanges of views from the standpoint that Japan and the Philippines will continue to contribute to regional peace, stability, and prosperity, end quote. I suggest that the fact Mr. Duterte meets with Emperor Akihito indicates how strongly the Japanese view and the importance they place on it, and on maintaining good relations with the Philippines. And that brings us to the points made here. 1. That no indications of, quote, whether relations with the US will be a summit topic, end quote, and 2. Mr. Abe will seek, quote, frank exchanges, end quote, concerning regional security issues. How might one parse all of this? Japan will, of course, be a, quote, dutiful and honourable ally, end quote, of the USA, and relay the USA's concerns to Mr. Duterte concerning those regional security issues. However, I strongly suspect that when the Japanese security services have removed the American bugs and ensconced Mr. Duterte and Mr. Abe in a soundproofed room deep underground and away from snooping US lasers being bounced off windows, that the conversation might be somewhat different, namely with both leaders agreeing that the USA has become the primary unpopular threat to peace and security just about everywhere it has gone lately. And that talk will turn to the inevitable decline of the US empire and the long-term need for other regional powers to step up to the plate. That, quote, even more frank, end quote, discussion is likely to include indications that Japan's remnant plans are destined to assuage American security concerns in the short term, while positioning Japan in the long term to be with India, the other counterpoise to growing China power in the region. As this article notes, Japan has already extended military aid to the Philippines, and in return for Japanese investments, one might expect that aid to be beefed up, perhaps even in the form of semi-permanent Japanese basing in the region. If this reading of Mr. Abe's government sounds a bit outlandish, only recall that recently Mr. Abe participated in demonstrations against the US base in Okinawa. We were told publicly, of course, that this was done without Mr. Abe's or his government's knowledge and approval. And if you believe that, there are several big bridges in Manhattan for sale, cheap. And as for Mr. Duterte, how will we know if he is following this geopolitical agenda? Watch for overtures to Indonesia, Malaysia, and eventually India, and perhaps even Russia. And as always, watch Mr. Abe's government very carefully, because we know Japan has huge connections to Washington, and that Washington has embedded governmental officials inside of the establishment, as they do everywhere in the globe. And again, this is really a very complex turn of events that is occurring, and this is why I'm covering the Asian area, specifically the Philippines, because it is a very critical part in this whole network of change. The outlandish vocal leader, President Duterte, is obviously playing a game to cleanse his country from the grip of the US, from the corruption that has currently taken place for decades. And he's wanting to remove the bases, which again plays into the benefit of Asia, because the more bases that you can remove from that region, the more secure that area is going to become. But the big question is, with all this upset that is coming from the Asian area and all the secret discussions that are taking place behind closed doors inside soundproof bunkers deep underground, as reported in this article, I think it is extremely likely that the Asian countries are going to be setting up agreements between each other for security, financial links, infrastructure links, to create a new booming economy on the flip side of when the West gets devastated by the global reset. They will grow out of this and become the new Eurozone, effectively, with the infrastructure that the European nations have. The setup that the European nations have will be converted into Asia. That will become the hub of the globe, and quite likely China being the epicenter. So, very interesting article, I think, guys. I'll leave it there. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll move on to the next videos.